It is indeed a great privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. As Peg said, I've spoken at a lot of UU churches. She said 250, now I'm over 260, but who's counting, right? I love UU churches. I love the diversity and respect for each other. It's a great privilege to be a part of your service today. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in Universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that their church was going to be having. It's going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is a few miles east of Des Moines. And it was to be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There was not a congregation there anymore, but they had the tradition of having one service there each summer as a way of celebrating their Universalist heritage. So I was happy to accept her invitation to join them for that service. And I'll always remember, as I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read, Universalist Church. And I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time, and that's why I wrote a book on the subject and travel around with my wife Darlene speaking on the subject of Universalism across the country. Today I'm going to be speaking on the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It is sometimes referred to as universal salvation, so I'd like to offer a definition of salvation that's probably different from what you've heard from other sources. You probably are aware that at least among conservative Christians, their definition of salvation would be to accept Jesus as your personal Savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, apparently that definition works for many people, but to me it's not very adequate because it doesn't necessarily require any change or growth. And so I've come up with a definition that works for me, and that is that salvation is to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. And if you don't believe in the divine, or if you don't believe in life after death, you can just leave those parts off the definition. So to me, the most basic understanding of salvation is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. So in contrast to what a lot of people believe, I reject the idea that many people are going to spend eternity suffering in hell. Instead, I believe that everyone will eventually experience salvation or fullness of life. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of Jesus, it was the conventional thinking of many people that a lot of people would spend eternity suffering in hell. But there were a couple of exceptions to that. First of all, there were the Zoroastrians. Perhaps you're aware that the Zoroastrian faith developed in the area of Persia, which is where the current country of Iran is. It developed in the 5th and the 6th centuries before the time of Jesus. So the idea of universalism, and they were universalists. So the idea of universalism is not a new idea, right? It's been around for at least 2,500 years, probably a lot longer than that. Another exception to the eternal damnation teaching that many people believed in was Jesus. It's very clear to me from many passages in the Bible that Jesus did not believe in a God of eternal damnation, but believed in universalism. In the environment, though, where the conventional thinking of the day was that a lot of people would spend eternity suffering in hell, it was sometimes difficult to convince them otherwise. And so there were some people, it seems to me, who weren't fully converted to Christianity. They became followers of Jesus, professed their faith in Jesus, but at the same time they held on to the belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But there were a lot of people who were fully converted. A couple of prominent examples of that would have been Clement and Origen of Alexandria, prominent theologians and leaders in the early church. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many others as well. As I said, though, there were some people who weren't fully converted to Christianity. One example of that was Tertullian. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, Tertullian so relished the idea of other people, of course it was other people, not himself, he so relished the idea of other people suffering in hell that he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Doesn't the thought of that just make you feel good all over? Isn't that astonishing? A person who professed to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and forgiveness and compassion and so on, could so relish the idea of so many people suffering excruciating torment in hell forever. The theologian Augustine was another example of a person who wasn't fully converted. He became a Christian at age 32 and held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But Augustine was a pretty decent theologian in many respects, so it's not surprising that his theology started to become dominant in the church. Augustine lived in the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century, so it's not surprising that by the 6th century there was coming to be quite a controversy over the issue of universalism. In order to resolve this controversy, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th Ecumenical Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that emperors like to control people. Isn't that a given? Emperors like to control people, and the people had learned back then that threatening people with eternal damnation was a foolproof means of controlling them. Of course, that's still true today, where many people seek to control their members and others by threatening them with eternal damnation. But the problem is, they were having trouble controlling those free-spirited Universalists. They could threaten them with unending hell all they wanted, and they didn't take it seriously. So the emperor allied himself with the hellraisers of the day, the people who advocated the teaching of unending suffering of many people beyond death. And together they pushed through a resolution which abolished the teaching of universalism. Now, it's not surprising, with all of the powers of the church and the state against the teaching, it's not surprising that the teaching of universalism went dormant after that, or underground. And that lasted for a long time. It really lasted for about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually it'll start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago, but it was about 300 years ago that the teaching of universalism, or the acceptance of the teaching of universalism, started to become a strong movement once again. John Wesley was the primary organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in the 18th century England. And he had a close association with a group of Christians called the Moravians. Now, the Moravians were Universalists, a wonderful group. They believed in universalism. But Wesley, even though he was close friends with them and he admired them very much, he just couldn't accept that idea of universalism. But he met them when he was in his 30s, but by late in his life, he too came to believe in universalism. I guess those Moravians eventually wore him down. Now, I love to tell United Methodists that John Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism. That is because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are the ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of universalism. At the same time, they can often be heard to say, let's go back and reestablish the teachings of John Wesley. And I say, yeah, let's do that. After all, Wesley, late in his life, came to embrace the teaching of universalism. The American colonies proved to be a particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741. He was a physician, and he did a lot to spread the teaching of universalism in eastern Pennsylvania and in New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came over from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of universalism throughout the American colonies. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. There were several really prominent women leaders among the early Universalists, or these more recent Universalists, actually, when you look at the whole scheme of things. Olympia Brown was one of the women leaders, and she was the first woman to be ordained by any denomination when she was ordained by the Universalists in 1863. Now, we United Methodists started ordaining women in 1956. In fact, I knew one of the original people, one of the original group in 1956, Nancy Nichols, her name. Wonderful lady. But anyway, we started ordaining women in 1956, and of course that seems pretty good considering that there's some churches that still don't ordain women, surprisingly enough. So I felt really good about the fact that we United Methodists started ordaining women in 1956, until I learned that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years when they ordained Olympia Brown in 1863. Hosea Ballou was the most prominent leader and theologian during his life and ministry. When he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising that they grew so rapidly, because the religious environment was just atrocious back then. I mean, there was a time that they called it the Great Awakening, led by Jonathan Edwards, but it was anything but an awakening. It was just a lot of damnation teachings. And so it's not surprising that a lot of people found the Universalist message to be a breath of fresh air. And so the Universalist Church grew very rapidly. And what a difference that made, working for women's suffrage and freeing of the slaves. Abraham Lincoln was an example of a person who believed in universalism. And so those Universalists made a powerful difference in the history of our country. But it wasn't only the Universalists or the Unitarians, though, that have taught universalism. And that is because there have been some prominent leaders and theologians in other denominations that have taught universalism as well. They didn't necessarily call it universalism or even universal salvation, but that's what it was. Some examples of theologians in the 20th century who taught universalism are Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Leslie Weatherhead, and many others as well. So the teaching of universalism has a long, rich history. For more than 500 years, think about that. That's a long time. For more than 500 years following the time of Jesus, and then especially again for the last 300 years as well. So you might wonder, why is this such an important issue for me as a United Methodist minister, since unfortunately universalism is not a part of the doctrine of our church? But it seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Everybody knows that they would never ever torture their own children without end. I mean, give me a break. That is literally an insane concept. We know what happens to people who torture their own children. They either end up in a mental hospital or in prison. Yet, they say that's what God will do for eternity, torturing naughty people forever. Give me a break. It is literally an insane concept. So the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs. And I'm grateful. When we went on the road 20 years ago, I knew a little bit about atheism, but I didn't know much. And it's been one of the high points of speaking at UU churches is I've met a lot of wonderful atheists. I didn't expect that. So that was a wonderful experience. There has been an ongoing wonderful experience to meet a lot of wonderful atheists in UU churches. Of course, I've met a lot of wonderful people of a great variety of faiths in UU churches. But I found that for some, they find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty with that. But when people of other denominations become atheists, that often is not such a positive thing. And that is because they may still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if there's no God to rescue them from that plight, then they sometimes conclude that they are doomed, and that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. We all want to make the world a better place. And that is what motivates me more than anything else to travel around the country speaking on universalism. We all want to make the world a better place, but we're not likely to accomplish very much in that regard as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in society at large. And the reason for that is because people's understanding of God has a powerful and profound influence on how they live their lives. So if people believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy to justify living that same way themselves. It's like the old song, One Tin Soldier goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people in our own country and around the world every day seeking to justify evil behavior in our own country and around the world. And it's much easier to do that if we believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. On the other hand, if we believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient and so on, we're much more likely to live according to those standards. This is of enormous significance. I believe if we want to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. That is because how people perceive God has a powerful and direct influence on how they live their lives. There was a man named Robert Short. He wrote a book entitled Something to Believe In. It's a wonderful book. It's a hilarious book, but it's on the subject of universalism. And one of the things he says in that book that are worth noting, he says that people tend to resemble the gods they serve. Isn't that profound? People tend to resemble the gods they serve. And so what we need to do is to change people's perception of God from being judgmental and condemning and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told, "You should not love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them." To which Lincoln replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Isn't that profound? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a Universalist. He rejected the teaching of a God of eternal damnation. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual. And because of that, he could love even his enemies. And what a difference that made in how he lived his life. It seems to me that we who believe in universalism are called to live the same way. We're called to rise above being judgmental and cruel in order to transform the world with love. So we who believe in universalism have wonderful good news to share with the world, and it's really important that we share that good news. Again, Robert Short, the author of the book Something to Believe In, he said, "There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies." Isn't that a mouthful? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. Then he goes on to say, "Therefore, our witness to them should be just as aggressive as theirs has been to us." Fundamentalists can be intimidating, can't they? They go around quoting scripture and asking people whether or not they're saved. So they can be intimidating. But I say, let's not be intimidated by them. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They instead spread a message that is divisive and leads to cruel and inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With their understanding of things, it is really no big deal to torture people, whether at Guantanamo Bay or wherever. After all, they believe that God will torture people forever. And if it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides, the torture that we might inflict upon others, whether it's waterboarding or whatever, is nothing compared to the torture that they say that God will inflict upon people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual. We who believe in universalism have a wonderful, powerfully, wonderfully important message to share with the world. So it is important that we not be intimidated by the hellraisers. The teaching of a God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse, while the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen.